You don't belong here. I know you're up to something. Probably trying to sneak into that courthouse to intimidate witnesses or cause trouble.
Officer, I'm Judge Samuel Webster. I work here. I'm simply going to my chambers.
Sure you are. Every criminal has a story. Turn around and put your hands behind your back.
There's no need
hands
for
behind
this.
you now.
A respected judge walked up the courthouse steps on a bright June morning in 2019, carrying his briefcase and preparing for another day of serving justice in Atlanta. He wore his customary professional suit and confident demeanor as he approached his workplace. What happened next would expose the shocking reality of racial profiling within the justice system itself, spark a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and force a police department to confront its deepest failures. The entire incident was captured on security cameras, and what the footage reveals is so disturbing that it ended one officer's career and left a nation questioning how deep systemic racism truly runs. The morning of June 9th, 2019, started like any other Monday in downtown Atlanta. The Fulton County Courthouse stood tall against the bright Georgia sky, its imposing columns and granite steps bustling with the usual parade of lawyers, clerks, defendants, and visitors. The clock had just struck 10:30 a.m. when the morning rush was in full swing. People in business suits hurried up the steps, briefcases in hand, while others lingered near the entrance, finishing last-minute phone calls with clients or colleagues. The courthouse had always been a symbol of justice in Atlanta, where important decisions were made daily that affected thousands of lives. On this particular morning, the building hummed with its typical energy as court sessions were about to begin across multiple floors. Security guards stood at their posts, checking bags and ensuring everyone passed through metal detectors in an orderly fashion. The marble floors echoed with the clicking of dress shoes and the soft murmur of legal conversations. Judge Samuel Webster was a fixture in this world. At 47 years old, he had earned his place among Atlanta's most respected jurists through 8 years of fair and thoughtful service on the bench. His journey to this position had not been easy. Growing up in a working-class family, Webster had excelled in school and earned a full scholarship to Harvard Law School, where he graduated near the top of his class. Before becoming a judge, Webster had spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney, fighting for justice on behalf of those who couldn't fight for themselves. He had taken on police brutality cases, housing discrimination lawsuits, and employment disputes where minorities faced unfair treatment. His reputation for thorough preparation and passionate advocacy had earned him respect throughout Atlanta's legal community, both among fellow attorneys and the judges before whom he appeared. When Webster was appointed to the bench, he brought that same dedication to fairness and justice that had defined his career as a lawyer. His courtroom was known for being a place where everyone received equal treatment, regardless of their background, race, or economic status. Fellow judges often sought his advice on difficult cases, and young attorneys looked up to him as a mentor and role model. Webster lived a quiet life outside the courthouse. He was married to his college sweetheart, a teacher at a local elementary school, and they had 2 teenage children who were both honor students. He coached youth basketball on weekends and served on the board of a local nonprofit that provided scholarships to underprivileged students. His colleagues knew him as someone who never missed a day of work and always arrived early to prepare for his cases. On this June morning, Webster had parked his car in his usual spot 3 blocks from the courthouse and began his familiar walk to work. He carried his worn leather briefcase, a gift from his wife when he first became a judge, and wore his standard navy blue suit with a crisp white shirt and conservative tie. His routine was the same every day, and he took pride in maintaining the dignity and professionalism that his position required. Officer Scott West had been patrolling the downtown courthouse district for 3 years, and in that time, he had developed a reputation that made many in the community uncomfortable. At 34 years old, West was a 12-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, but his service record told a troubling story that his supervisors had consistently chosen to ignore. The complaints against West had started almost immediately after he joined the force. In his first year alone, 3 separate incidents had been reported to Internal Affairs. A black businessman claimed West had pulled him over for no reason and searched his expensive car while making comments about how he must have stolen it. A young black college student reported that West had stopped her while she was walking to class, demanding to know why she was in a nice neighborhood and refusing to believe she attended the nearby university. An elderly black man filed a complaint after West had questioned him aggressively while he waited at a bus stop, accusing him of loitering. Each time, the internal affairs investigations reached the same conclusion. The complaints were deemed unfounded or unsubstantiated. West's supervisors accepted his explanations that he was simply doing his job and following proper police procedures. The pattern continued year after year, with complaints piling up in his personnel file like leaves that no one bothered to rake away. West had grown up in Marietta, a predominantly white suburb north of Atlanta. His father had been a factory supervisor, and his mother worked as a secretary at a local insurance company. The family lived in a neighborhood where diversity meant having one or two families who weren't of European descent. West's exposure to different cultures and communities had been limited during his formative years, and when he joined the police force, those limitations became dangerous. The complaints against West weren't just about individual incidents. Fellow officers had witnessed him make racially charged comments during roll call and in the locker room. He frequently used coded language when describing suspects, referring to certain neighborhoods as those areas, and making assumptions about crimes based on the race of the people involved. When other officers tried to address his behavior, West would brush off their concerns or claim he was just being realistic about crime patterns. West's assignment to the courthouse district should have been seen as a warning sign. He had specifically requested the transfer, telling colleagues that he wanted to keep an eye on the types of people who hang around courthouses. His supervisors approved the transfer without question, despite the fact that several community leaders had complained about his aggressive tactics in previous assignments. The body camera violations had been another red flag that went ignored. On at least 6 occasions, West's camera had mysteriously malfunctioned during controversial encounters. Each time, he claimed technical difficulties, and each time, his supervisors accepted the explanation with minimal investigation. The department's policy required officers to immediately report camera malfunctions and have them repaired, but West often went days or even weeks before addressing the issues. Training records showed that West had missed several mandatory sessions on cultural sensitivity and bias awareness. When he did attend, instructors noted that he seemed disengaged and often challenged scenarios that involved officers making mistakes in their interactions with minorities. His psychological evaluations, conducted every 3 years as required by department policy, had raised minor concerns about his attitudes toward authority and his tendency to see threats where none existed. But these concerns were never deemed serious enough to warrant intervention. The police union had consistently protected West throughout his career, arguing that he was being unfairly targeted because of his aggressive policing style. Union representatives claimed that the complaints against him were part of a broader attack on law enforcement, and that West was simply doing the job that citizens expected officers to do. This institutional protection had created a bubble around West that insulated him from the consequences of his actions. By 2019, West had developed an almost predatory focus on the courthouse area. He would position himself near the entrance, watching people come and go, and frequently stopping individuals he deemed suspicious. Court clerks had noticed his behavior and mentioned it to supervisors, but nothing was ever done. Some defense attorneys had even begun warning their black clients to be extra careful when approaching the courthouse, knowing that West might target them for harassment. The morning of June 9th found West in his usual position, scanning the crowds of people heading to work at the courthouse. His radio crackled with routine communications, and his body camera was functioning perfectly. He had no calls to respond to, and no immediate duties to perform. He was simply watching and waiting, looking for someone who fit his preconceived notions of what a criminal looked like. The security cameras mounted high on the courthouse walls captured every detail of what happened next, with cold, mechanical precision. Judge Samuel Webster appeared in the frame at exactly 10:30 a.m., his confident stride carrying him up the familiar granite steps. His navy suit was perfectly pressed, his leather briefcase swinging slightly at his side as he navigated the morning crowd of legal professionals and courthouse visitors. His expression was calm and focused, the look of a man who had walked these same steps hundreds of times before. Officer Scott West stood near the main entrance, his position strategically chosen to observe everyone entering the building. When Webster came into view, West's entire demeanor changed. His casual stance shifted to alert attention, his eyes fixed on the approaching black man in the expensive suit. Something about the sight triggered every bias and assumption that had been building in West's mind over years of misconduct. Here was a well-dressed black man approaching the courthouse, and in West's distorted worldview, that could only mean trouble. Webster continued his approach, completely unaware that he had become the target of racial profiling. He nodded politely to a colleague who passed by going the other direction and checked his watch, noting that he had plenty of time before his first hearing of the day. His mind was occupied with the cases on his docket, the legal arguments he would need to consider, and the decisions that would affect the lives of the people appearing before him. West stepped directly into Webster's path, blocking access to the courthouse entrance with deliberate aggression. The officer's body language was confrontational from the start, his shoulders squared and his hand resting near his duty belt in a gesture meant to intimidate. His face showed suspicion and hostility as he looked Webster up and down, taking in the expensive suit and professional appearance, but seeing only what his prejudices allowed him to see. Webster stopped walking and looked up at the officer with surprise but not alarm. In his years on the bench, he had dealt with law enforcement officers daily and understood the importance of remaining calm and professional in all interactions. He assumed this was perhaps a security checkpoint or some routine matter that could be quickly resolved. His expression remained composed and respectful as he waited for the officer to explain the reason for the stop. "Excuse me," West said, his voice already carrying an edge of suspicion and authority that suggested this would not be a routine interaction. His tone was demanding rather than polite, immediately establishing a confrontational dynamic that had nothing to do with legitimate law enforcement and everything to do with the color of Webster's skin. Webster maintained his professional demeanor and replied calmly, "Good morning, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" His voice was steady and respectful, the tone of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations through patience and clear communication. He shifted his briefcase slightly and prepared to show his courthouse identification, assuming this was simply a matter of verifying his credentials to enter the building. But West's response made it clear that this was about much more than identification. "I need to know what you're doing here," the officer demanded, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "You don't look like you belong in this courthouse." The words hung in the air like a challenge, revealing the racial assumptions that were driving this encounter from the very beginning. Webster's eyebrows raised slightly in surprise, but he maintained his composure. Years of experience as both a civil rights attorney and a judge had taught him how to handle situations where his presence was questioned because of his race. "I work here," he replied clearly and calmly. "I'm Judge Samuel Webster, and I'm on my way to my chambers to prepare for this morning's court sessions." West's reaction to this information was telling. Rather than apologizing for the misunderstanding or asking to see Webster's credentials, he became even more confrontational. "Sure you are," he said with obvious disbelief and sarcasm. "Every criminal has a story about why they belong somewhere they don't." The accusation was delivered with such certainty that it revealed the depth of West's racial bias and his complete inability to conceive that a black man in a business suit could legitimately belong in the courthouse as anything other than a defendant. The security cameras captured Webster's momentary shock at being called a criminal, followed by his deliberate effort to maintain his dignity and professionalism. He could see that other courthouse employees and attorneys were beginning to notice the confrontation, and he was acutely aware that how he handled this situation would be scrutinized by everyone watching. His years of experience in civil rights law had taught him that encounters like this could escalate quickly and dangerously, especially when dealing with officers who had already made up their minds about guilt based on race alone. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job," Webster said, his voice remaining calm but firm. "I'm happy to show you my identification and courthouse credentials. I've been a judge here for 8 years, and I'm simply trying to get to work." He reached slowly toward his jacket pocket, where he kept his wallet and courthouse ID, moving deliberately and carefully to avoid any actions that could be misinterpreted as threatening. But West was not interested in seeing identification or resolving the situation peacefully. His mind had already decided that this was a dangerous criminal trying to talk his way into the courthouse, possibly to intimidate witnesses or disrupt proceedings. The officer's hand moved toward his radio, and his stance became even more aggressive as he prepared to escalate the situation, far beyond anything that the circumstances justified. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as this encounter between a respected judge and a racist police officer began to spiral toward a confrontation that would expose the ugly reality of racial profiling within the justice system itself Every word spoken and every gesture made was being recorded by multiple security cameras, creating a permanent record of what was about to become one of the most shocking examples of institutional racism caught on video. West's hand shot up to stop Webster from reaching for his identification, his voice rising to a threatening level that could be heard clearly across the courthouse steps. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, treating the judge like a dangerous criminal rather than a man trying to cooperate with a simple request. The officer's aggressive reaction drew more attention from the growing crowd of courthouse employees and attorneys who were arriving for work. Webster immediately raised both hands in a gesture of compliance, his briefcase still clutched in his right hand. His face showed a mixture of concern and disbelief as he realized this situation was escalating far beyond a simple misunderstanding. "Officer, I was just trying to get my identification as you requested," he said calmly, his voice carrying the authority and measured tone that had served him well in years of courtroom proceedings. "I didn't ask for your identification," West snapped back, his face flushing with anger and something that looked like embarrassment at being corrected. "I asked what you're doing here, and I don't believe a word you're saying." His accusation was delivered with such venom that several witnesses later described feeling shocked by the obvious hatred in his voice. The officer seemed determined to find guilt where none existed, driven by prejudices that had been festering for years. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather on the courthouse steps. Court clerks, bailiffs, and attorneys who arrived early for work stopped to watch the unfolding confrontation. Some of them recognized Judge Webster immediately and exchanged confused glances, unable to understand why a respected member of the judiciary was being treated like a criminal suspect. Their whispered conversations created a low murmur that seemed to agitate West even further. Webster noticed the gathering crowd and felt a deep sense of professional embarrassment, but he also understood that these witnesses could be crucial if this situation continued to escalate. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice remaining steady despite the stress of the situation. "Perhaps we could resolve this quickly so I can get to my courtroom and these folks can get to their jobs." West's response revealed the calculated nature of what happened next. He glanced around at the growing crowd of witnesses, his eyes taking in the courthouse employees who were watching with increasing concern and confusion. The officer's face showed a moment of uncertainty as he seemed to realize that his actions were being observed and potentially recorded by multiple people. It was at this critical moment that West made a decision that would later be described by prosecutors as evidence of his consciousness of guilt. Without breaking eye contact with Webster, West reached down to his uniform shirt where his body camera was mounted. The device had been recording everything up to this point, capturing his aggressive behavior and racially charged accusations in high-definition video. But with deliberate and unmistakable intent, West pressed the button that would disable the recording function. The small LED light that indicated active recording went dark, and with it went the official police department record of what was about to unfold. Several witnesses later testified that they saw West turn off his camera and understood immediately that something very wrong was about to happen. The act was so brazenly intentional that it sent a chill through the crowd of legal professionals who recognized it as evidence that the officer knew his subsequent actions would be indefensible if recorded on official police equipment. With his body camera disabled, West's behavior became noticeably more aggressive and his language more explicitly racist. "You people think you can just walk into any building and act like you own the place," he said, his voice dripping with racial animosity that had been barely contained during the recorded portion of their interaction. The change in his demeanor was so dramatic that witnesses described it as watching someone remove a mask to reveal their true face. Webster felt a chill of recognition as he realized he was now dealing with an officer who had deliberately disabled his recording equipment and was escalating to outright racial harassment. His years as a civil rights attorney had taught him that this was often the moment when police encounters turned dangerous for black men, regardless of their education, profession, or social status. But his judicial experience also told him that maintaining his dignity and clearly articulating what was happening could be crucial for any legal proceedings that might follow. "Officer, I need you to understand that I am Judge Samuel Webster, and you have just disabled your body camera while detaining me without cause," he said clearly and loudly enough for the witnesses to hear. His legal training kicked in as he began creating a verbal record of the constitutional violations that were occurring. I am not resisting or threatening you in any way, and I am asking you to allow me to show my credentials so we can resolve this matter. But West was beyond listening to reason or legal arguments. The officer seemed to interpret Webster's calm authority as a challenge to his own power, and his response revealed the deep-seated racism that had been driving his behavior from the beginning. "I don't care what you claim to be," he shouted. "All I see is another black man trying to clean his way into places he doesn't belong." The crowd of witnesses gasped audibly at the explicitly racial nature of West's statement. Several courthouse employees began pulling out their phones to record the encounter, while others hurried inside to alert supervisors and security personnel about what was happening on the front steps. The situation had moved far beyond a simple misunderstanding and had become a public display of racial profiling that was shocking even to legal professionals who dealt with difficult situations daily. Webster maintained his composure despite the personal attack, but his voice carried a new edge of steel as he responded. "Officer, you are violating my civil rights, and every person watching can see exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it." His words were chosen carefully, both to document the violations for the record and to make clear to everyone present that this was about race, not legitimate law enforcement. West's face contorted with rage at Webster's calm assertion of his civil rights, and the officer took a step closer, using his physical presence to intimidate the judge. "You're under arrest," he announced loudly, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps with unmistakable authority. The declaration sent shockwaves through the crowd of witnesses, many of whom knew Judge Webster personally and could not believe what they were seeing unfold before their eyes. "On what charges?" Webster asked, his legal training compelling him to seek clarity even as he realized the situation had moved beyond reason or law. His voice remained steady, but those who knew him could detect the underlying tension as he prepared himself for what was clearly going to be a traumatic and unjustified arrest. West's response revealed the fabricated nature of his justification. "Trespassing, disorderly conduct, and obstruction of justice," he declared, listing charges that had no basis in anything Webster had actually done. The officer seemed to be improvising, pulling from a standard list of charges commonly used to justify questionable arrests when no real crime had been committed. The crowd erupted in protests as West moved behind Webster and roughly grabbed his arms. "That's Judge Webster," called out Maria Gonzalez, a court clerk who had worked with the judge for 5 years. "He works here. This is his courthouse." Her voice carried a mixture of outrage and disbelief as she watched a respected member of the judiciary being treated like a common criminal. "He's telling the truth, officer," shouted David Chen, an attorney who had appeared before Webster's bench dozens of times. "I've known Judge Webster for years. He's a sitting judge in this building." Other voices joined in, with courthouse employees and legal professionals trying to intervene on behalf of their colleague. But West seemed determined to proceed with the arrest, regardless of the mounting evidence that he was making a catastrophic mistake. "All of you stay back," he ordered the crowd, his free hand moving toward his service weapon in a gesture that silenced the protests and created a tense standoff on the courthouse steps. The implied threat was clear, and witnesses later described feeling terrified that the situation might escalate to violence. Webster felt the cold metal of handcuffs being applied to his wrists, the click of each restraint echoing in his ears like a symbol of injustice. Despite the humiliation and the growing anger he felt at being treated this way, he forced himself to remain calm and focused on documenting every aspect of the encounter for the legal battle he knew would follow. "Officer West," Webster said, having noticed the name tag on the officer's uniform, "I want you to understand that you are arresting a sitting judge without probable cause after disabling your body camera and in front of dozens of witnesses who can verify my identity and position." His words were delivered with judicial authority, creating an official record even without the benefit of police recording equipment. The mention of his name seemed to surprise West, who had apparently not expected his victim to pay attention to such details. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face as he realized that this arrest was being conducted in the full light of day with multiple witnesses who were clearly documenting everything that was happening. Sarah Williams, a veteran court reporter who had worked in the building for 20 years, stepped forward despite West's earlier warning. "Officer, I have to tell you that you're making a serious mistake," she said, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of experience in legal proceedings. Judge Webster has been presiding over cases in this building for 8 years. Everyone here knows him. West's response revealed how deeply committed he was to his course of action, despite the overwhelming evidence of his error. "I don't care what any of you say," he declared. "This man was acting suspiciously, refused to cooperate, and I'm taking him in for questioning." His justification bore no resemblance to what witnesses had actually observed, but he seemed determined to create his own version of events. As West began to guide Webster toward his patrol car, the judge turned to address the growing crowd of colleagues and courthouse employees. "Please remember what you've seen here today," he said, in a voice that carried both dignity and sadness. "This is about more than just me. This is about how people are treated when the system fails to protect their basic rights." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Judge Webster was led away in handcuffs, his briefcase left behind on the courthouse steps where it had fallen during the arrest. The symbolism was powerful and heartbreaking. A man who had dedicated his career to justice being denied that same justice because of the color of his skin. Phone cameras captured every moment of the arrest, with multiple angles documenting West's aggressive behavior and Webster's dignified response. Social media posts began appearing immediately, with courthouse employees and attorneys sharing their shock and outrage at what they had witnessed. The hashtag Justice for Judge Webster began trending within hours as word spread through Atlanta's legal community. Inside the courthouse, news of the arrest spread quickly through the halls and courtrooms. Judges interrupted their proceedings to discuss the unprecedented situation with their staff. Court administrators scrambled to reorganize the day's schedule as it became clear that Judge Webster would not be available for his planned hearings. The entire building seemed to be in a state of shock as people tried to process what had happened to one of their most respected colleagues. The arrest marked a turning point that would reverberate through Atlanta's criminal justice system and beyond. What had started as a routine morning for Judge Webster had transformed into a defining moment that would expose the ugly reality of racial bias within law enforcement and create a legal battle that would ultimately cost the city millions of dollars while forcing long overdue conversations about police accountability and civil rights. Within minutes of Judge Webster being driven away in the patrol car, the courthouse erupted into organized chaos as employees and attorneys mobilized to address what they recognized as an unprecedented crisis. Chief Judge Patricia Thompson received an emergency phone call while presiding over a murder trial, and she immediately called for a recess to deal with the situation. Her voice shook with a mixture of anger and disbelief as court staff explained that one of her most respected colleagues had been arrested on the courthouse steps. The first priority was confirming Webster's location and securing his immediate release. Court Administrator Robert Martinez contacted the Atlanta Police Department's Central Dispatch, demanding to know where Judge Webster had been taken and on what authority a sitting judge had been arrested while reporting for work. His calls were met with confusion and delay as police supervisors scrambled to understand how such a catastrophic mistake had occurred under their watch. Meanwhile, news of the arrest spread through Atlanta's legal community like wildfire. Text messages, phone calls, and social media posts created a network of outrage and support that reached every law firm, court building, and legal aid office in the city. Prominent civil rights attorney Angela Davis, who had known Webster since his days as a civil rights lawyer, immediately contacted her partners to begin preparing legal action, while also reaching out to media contacts to ensure the story received proper coverage. Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms received an emergency call from her chief of staff while attending a routine budget meeting. The mayor's face went pale as she learned that a sitting judge had been arrested by city police in what appeared to be a clear case of racial profiling. She immediately ordered her legal team to investigate and demanded a full briefing from Police Chief Erica Shields within the hour. The police department's initial response revealed the institutional dysfunction that had allowed Officer West's behavior to continue unchecked for years. When supervisors first learned of the arrest, some actually defended West's actions, suggesting that he had followed proper procedures for dealing with suspicious individuals near the courthouse. It took several phone calls from ranking officials before the full scope of the disaster began to sink in. Detective Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, an African-American supervisor who had dealt with complaints about West before, immediately recognized the name and understood the gravity of the situation. He personally drove to the holding facility where Webster was being processed and ordered his immediate release, but not before the judge had been subjected to the humiliating experience of being fingerprinted and photographed like a common criminal. The media response was swift and intense. Channel 2. Action News received a tip from a courthouse employee within 30 minutes of the arrest, and reporter Sofia Rodriguez arrived on the scene just as police supervisors were beginning their damage control efforts. Her interviews with witnesses created the first television coverage of the incident, and the footage of the courthouse steps where Webster had been arrested became an iconic image of institutional racism. Social media amplified the story beyond Atlanta's borders as legal professionals across the country shared their shock and solidarity. The Georgia Bar Association issued an emergency statement condemning the arrest and demanding a full investigation. Civil rights organizations began mobilizing protests and legal support, recognizing that Webster's case represented a perfect example of how racial bias operates even against the most successful and respected members of the Black community. Inside the courthouse, the emotional toll on staff was immediately apparent. Black employees in particular struggled with the realization that if a sitting judge could be arrested and humiliated based solely on his race, then none of them were truly safe from similar treatment. Many reported feeling traumatized by watching their colleague and mentor being led away in handcuffs for the crime of walking to work while Black. The legal implications began crystallizing as attorneys throughout the city recognized the constitutional violations that had occurred. Fourth Amendment experts noted that Webster had been seized without reasonable suspicion, while civil rights lawyers focused on the clear evidence of racial discrimination. The fact that West had deliberately disabled his body camera was seen as consciousness of guilt that would make any defense of his actions nearly impossible. Federal authorities took notice within hours of the incident. The FBI's Civil Rights Division received multiple complaints about the arrest, and officials began preliminary discussions about whether federal charges might be appropriate. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division also opened a file on the case, recognizing it as a potential catalyst for broader investigation into Atlanta Police Department practices. By evening, the arrest had become national news, with cable television networks featuring the story and legal experts debating its implications for police accountability and judicial independence. The image of a respected Black judge being arrested at his own courthouse became a powerful symbol of how far the country still had to go in addressing systemic racism within law enforcement. The Atlanta Police Department found itself in full crisis mode as officials realized that Officer West's actions had not only violated an individual's rights, but had also damaged the department's relationship with the entire legal community. Internal affairs investigators began reviewing West's personnel file, finally paying serious attention to the pattern of complaints that had been ignored for years. The legal machinery began moving with unprecedented speed as Judge Webster's legal team, led by renowned civil rights attorney Angela Davis, filed a comprehensive federal lawsuit just 6 weeks after the arrest. The complaint, which ran over 40 pages, detailed not only the specific constitutional violations Webster had endured, but also the systemic failures within the Atlanta Police Department that had allowed Officer West's pattern of racist behavior to continue unchecked for over a decade. The lawsuit sought damages under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act, alleging that West had violated Webster's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure and his 14th Amendment rights to equal protection under the law. The complaint also included claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to deny civil rights. The legal team demanded $4.2 million in compensatory damages, plus punitive damages to be determined at trial. Federal prosecutors moved quickly on the criminal side of the case after reviewing the extensive video, evidence, and witness statements. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia announced that Officer West would face federal charges under Title 18, Section 242, which makes it a crime for anyone acting under color of law to willfully deprive a person of their constitutional rights. The charge carried a maximum sentence of 1 year in prison, but prosecutors indicated they were considering additional charges related to evidence tampering for West's deliberate disabling of his body camera. The Atlanta Police Department's internal investigation concluded within 2 months, finding that West had violated multiple departmental policies, including those related to bias-free policing, proper detention procedures, and body camera protocols. Chief Erica Shields announced West's termination at a press conference where she acknowledged that the department had failed to properly address the warning signs in his behavior over the years. The termination was upheld after a brief appeals process, despite protests from the police union. The Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council moved to permanently revoke West's law enforcement certification, effectively barring him from ever working as a police officer again in the state. The council cited his criminal conviction and the egregious nature of his civil rights violations as grounds for the permanent ban, sending a strong message to other officers about the consequences of racist behavior. Settlement negotiations began in earnest after the city's legal team reviewed the evidence and realized they had virtually no defense against Webster's claims. The security camera footage showing West deliberately disabling his body camera while detaining Webster without cause created an unassailable record of constitutional violations. Combined with West's history of complaints and the testimony of numerous witnesses, the city faced the prospect of a jury trial that could result in an even larger verdict. The $4.2 million settlement agreement, reached after 4 months of mediation, was one of the largest civil rights settlements in Atlanta's history. The agreement included not only monetary compensation for Webster, but also mandatory reforms within the police department. These reforms included enhanced bias training for all officers, stricter policies governing body camera use with automatic disciplinary action for unauthorized disabling, and the creation of an independent civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate misconduct complaints. The settlement also required the Atlanta Police Department to implement an early warning system to identify officers with patterns of complaints before their behavior escalated to criminal violations. The system would flag officers for mandatory counseling and additional training based on the number and nature of complaints received, addressing the institutional failures that had allowed West's behavior to continue unchecked. Federal oversight became a crucial component of the resolution, with a court-appointed monitor assigned to ensure compliance with the settlement terms for a period of 5 years. The monitor, a former federal prosecutor with extensive experience in police reform cases, would have full access to department records and the authority to recommend additional changes if the agreed-upon reforms proved insufficient. On the criminal side, West ultimately pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations rather than face a jury trial where the video evidence would have made conviction almost certain. He received an 18-month prison sentence, which was considered significant for a first-time federal civil rights conviction. The guilty plea also meant that West could never again claim innocence or attempt to justify his actions, providing a measure of vindication for Webster and the broader community. The case established important legal precedents regarding police accountability and the protection of judicial independence. Federal courts cited the Webster case in subsequent decisions involving police misconduct, particularly in cases where officers had deliberately disabled recording equipment to hide their illegal behavior. The case also strengthened protections for all citizens against racially motivated police stops, with courts using Webster's experience to illustrate how bias can operate even against individuals in positions of authority and respect. Judge Samuel Webster returned to his courthouse chambers 3 months after the arrest, walking up those same granite steps where his civil rights had been violated. The journey back was both symbolic and deeply personal, representing not just his individual resilience, but also his commitment to ensuring that his traumatic experience would lead to meaningful change in how the justice system treats all citizens, regardless of race. Webster's decision to remain on the bench, despite offers from prestigious law firms and advocacy organizations, demonstrated his belief that the courthouse was exactly where he needed to be. His colleagues welcomed him back with a standing ovation during the monthly judges' meeting, but Webster made it clear that he wanted no special treatment or sympathy. Instead, he channeled his experience into becoming an even more passionate advocate for civil rights and police accountability from his position on the bench. The settlement money, while substantial, was never Webster's primary motivation for pursuing legal action. He donated a significant portion of the $4.2 million to establish the Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund, which provides free legal representation to victims of police misconduct, who cannot afford attorneys. The fund has since handled over 200 cases, helping to hold officers accountable and securing justice for families who might otherwise have had no recourse. Webster also used his platform to speak at law schools, police academies, and community forums about the ongoing reality of racial profiling in America. His speeches, which combine legal expertise with personal testimony, became powerful tools for education and reform. He frequently emphasized that his case was not unique except for the fact that his position as a judge gave him resources and visibility that most victims of police misconduct never receive. The trauma of the arrest left lasting psychological scars that Webster continues to address through therapy and support from his family and community. He has been open about experiencing anxiety and hypervigilance in situations involving police officers, acknowledging that even his privileged position could not shield him from the emotional impact of racial trauma. His honesty about these struggles has helped other victims feel less alone in their recovery process. Webster's judicial work has taken on new dimensions since the arrest, with his courtroom becoming known as a place where civil rights violations are taken seriously and police misconduct is scrutinized carefully. Defense attorneys frequently request that their clients' cases be heard in Webster's court, knowing that he brings both legal expertise and personal understanding to issues of police accountability. His sentencing in police misconduct cases has become more stringent, reflecting his belief that officers who violate citizens' rights must face meaningful consequences. The reforms implemented as part of the settlement agreement have had mixed results. The Civilian Oversight Board has investigated dozens of complaints and recommended disciplinary action in several cases, but critics argue that the police department still resists meaningful accountability. The body camera policies have been more successful, with violations now resulting in automatic suspension and retraining. The early warning system has identified several officers with troubling patterns of complaints, though some community advocates argue that the interventions have been too mild to create real change. Officer Scott West's life took a dramatically different trajectory after his conviction and imprisonment. He served 14 months of his 18-month sentence in federal prison, where he reportedly spent most of his time in protective custody due to threats from other inmates who learned about his crimes. Upon his release, he faced the challenge of rebuilding his life without the career that had defined his adult identity. West's attempts to find employment have been hampered by his criminal record and the notoriety of his case. Several potential employers recognized his name from news coverage and declined to hire him. He eventually found work at a warehouse outside Atlanta, far from the courthouse where his racist actions destroyed both his career and Webster's sense of security. West has never publicly apologized for his actions, maintaining silence even as his case became a national symbol of police racism. The broader impact of Webster's case extends far beyond Atlanta, influencing police reform discussions in cities across the country. The case has been cited in federal court decisions, academic research on racial bias in policing, and legislative debates about police accountability. Civil rights organizations use Webster's story as an example of how systemic racism operates at every level of society, affecting even those who have achieved significant professional success. Training programs for police officers now frequently include the Webster case as an example of how racial bias can lead to catastrophic legal and professional consequences. The image of a respected judge being arrested at his own courthouse has become a powerful teaching tool about the importance of treating all citizens with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or appearance. Webster's legacy continues to evolve as he approaches his 60th birthday and considers his long-term plans for retirement. He has written a book about his experience that combines legal analysis with personal reflection, and he continues to mentor young attorneys who are passionate about civil rights work. His name has become synonymous with resilience and the ongoing fight for racial justice, inspiring a new generation of advocates who understand that the struggle for equality remains far from over. The courthouse where Webster was arrested now bears a small plaque commemorating the incident and the reforms that followed, serving as a reminder to all who enter that justice requires constant vigilance and the courage to confront injustice wherever it appears. Webster passes that plaque every day as he continues his work, carrying forward the hope that his painful experience will help create a more just society for future generations.